I'm not proud of this story. That's probably the first thing I should say before anyone gets the wrong idea. I'm not writing this because I think it's clever or because I want approval. Honestly, I've gone back and forth about posting this at all. But I've seen people here share worse, and maybe someone reading this will understand how easy it is to cross a line you once thought you'd never even approach. My name's William. At least, that's the one I'm using here. A few years ago, I owned a small logistics company. Nothing huge, but enough to make me feel like I'd made it: contracts, employees, a decent office, the whole thing. From the outside, it looked stable, reliable, respectable. It wasn't. The truth is, I had been drowning in debt for longer than anyone knew. Bad investments, worse timing, and a couple of decisions I convinced myself were temporary fixes snowballed into something I couldn't control. Loans stacked on loans. Lines of credit maxed out. Suppliers waiting. Employees trusting me. And me? I kept smiling and shaking hands like everything was fine. That's the part nobody tells you. Collapse doesn't happen all at once. It's slow. Quiet. You adjust to it. You normalize it. Until one day, you realize there's no fixing it. That's when I first seriously considered disappearing. Not physically. Not running off to another country with a fake passport or anything dramatic like that. No, what I mean is something far more mundane and, in some ways, more dangerous. Making the business disappear. Fictitious bankruptcy. At the time, I didn't even call it fraud in my head. I called it survival. I remember the exact moment things shifted from "I'll fix this" to "there's no fixing this." It was a Tuesday morning. Nothing dramatic. No shouting, no final notice stamped in red. Just an email from one of our biggest suppliers saying they were freezing deliveries until we cleared overdue invoices. Polite, professional, final. That one message set off a chain reaction in my head. Without them, we couldn't fulfill contracts. Without contracts, no incoming cash. Without cash, well, you get it. I sat there staring at the screen, realizing every temporary solution I'd stacked up was about to collapse at once. Loans I'd taken to cover other loans. Payments delayed just long enough to keep things moving. It all depended on momentum, and suddenly, momentum was gone. I didn't panic right away. That came later. At first, I did what I always did: opened spreadsheets, ran numbers, tried to force a solution into existence. But every scenario ended the same way: insolvency. Public, messy, humiliating insolvency. And worse, it wouldn't just ruin me. It would drag everyone connected to me down too. That's when the idea came back. Not as a passing thought this time, but as an option. I didn't come up with fictitious bankruptcy on my own. I wish I could say I did. It would make this feel less calculated somehow. But the truth is, the seed had been planted months earlier during a late-night conversation with a guy I barely trusted but listened to anyway. He'd said it casually, like it was just another business strategy. Sometimes it's cheaper to let a company die than to save it. Then he mentioned people who managed their exits, assets moved, liabilities left behind, a clean slate on the other side. At the time, I brushed it off. Told myself I wasn't that kind of person. But sitting there on that Tuesday, staring at numbers that didn't work, I started replaying that conversation in my head. Over and over. This time, it didn't sound reckless. It sounded practical. That's how it begins, I think. Not with a bold decision, but with quiet justification. I told myself I wasn't stealing. I was protecting what I'd built. That I deserved a second chance. That everyone bends the rules when things get bad enough. And once you start thinking like that, the line you won't cross starts to move. Once I let the idea settle in, something in me shifted. I stopped asking if I would do it, and started thinking about how. That's the part that scares me now, how quickly it became practical. I began small. Just organizing things. Moving money between accounts under the excuse of simplifying operations. Creating a clearer structure, I told myself. In reality, I was mapping out what could be separated from the company before it went under. I spent nights going through contracts, assets, anything that had value. Equipment, client lists, even intangible things like relationships I could carry over somewhere else. I wasn't panicking anymore, I was methodical. What surprised me most was how normal it felt. During the day, I still showed up to the office, joked with employees, reassured clients. No one noticed anything different. That almost made it easier. If nobody suspected anything, maybe it wasn't as wrong as it felt in the beginning. Of course, that's a lie you tell yourself. Because deep down, I knew exactly what I was preparing for. The first real step wasn't dramatic. No big transfer, no sudden disappearance of assets. That would have been obvious. Instead, I made small, almost boring decisions that added up over time. I set up a second company under a different structure, legitimate on paper, nothing that would raise alarms. Different name, different focus, but close enough that I could later justify shifting certain operations there. At least, that's what I told myself. Then came the reallocation. A piece of equipment moved because it was better suited elsewhere. A contract reassigned due to operational efficiency. Money transferred as temporary support between entities. Individually, each move made sense. Together, they were something else entirely. What made it unsettling was how little resistance there was. Banks processed transfers. Clients signed updated agreements without much thought. Employees adapted because that's what employees do. They trust leadership to know what it's doing. No alarms. No questions. That silence was dangerous. It gave me confidence I didn't deserve. At some point, moving things quietly wasn't enough. I needed a narrative, something that would explain the cracks before they turned into a collapse. People don't panic if they think they understand what's happening. So I gave them a version of the truth. I started telling clients we were restructuring to stay competitive. That word, restructuring, it buys you time. Sounds responsible, even proactive. With employees, I was more careful. I framed it as short-term turbulence, something we'd push through together. I hated those conversations the most. Looking people in the eye, knowing I wasn't being honest, but still sounding convincing. Some of them had been with me for years. They believed me because they wanted to believe me. And I leaned into that. I scheduled meetings, sent updates, kept communication just transparent enough to feel real but vague enough to hide what I was actually doing. Every message was calculated to keep things stable a little longer. The strange part? The more I said it out loud, the more I almost believed it myself. Almost up until then, everything had gone almost too smoothly. That should have been a warning sign. Instead, I took it as proof I was in control. Then one of our older clients called. He wasn't angry at first, just confused. He noticed the contract transfer, the new company name, the subtle changes that most people ignored. But he'd been around long enough to know how businesses really work. He asked simple questions. The kind that don't sound threatening but cut straight through whatever story you're telling. Why the change so suddenly? Why move this contract specifically? Is everything okay on your end? I gave him the same polished answers I'd been using. Restructuring. Efficiency. Future growth. There was a pause on the line that lasted just a little too long. He didn't accuse me of anything. Didn't threaten to pull out. But his tone changed. Less trusting. More careful. That conversation stuck with me longer than I expected. Because for the first time, I realized someone might actually see what I was doing. And if one person noticed, others eventually would too. After that call, I had a choice. I could slow down, maybe even stop. Try to salvage what was left and face the fallout like a normal person. I didn't. Instead, I accelerated. That's the part one still struggled to explain, even to myself. It wasn't panic exactly. More like a realization that hesitation would only make things worse. If I was going to do this, I had to commit fully. Half measures would expose everything. So I started consolidating what remained. Larger transfers. Final contract shifts. I closed accounts that no longer served a purpose and redirected anything of value into places that were safer, less visible. I told myself it was just the final phase of the same plan, but it felt different. Heavier. More deliberate. There was no pretending anymore that this was just restructuring. This was the point where it clearly became something else. Fraud, if I'm being honest. And once you acknowledge that, there's no comfortable way to keep going. But I did anyway. Because by then, turning back didn't feel like an option. When everything was in place, the actual collapse happened faster than I expected. Almost disappointingly simple, considering how much time I'd spent preparing for it. Missed payments. Delayed responses. A few carefully timed defaults. From the outside, it looked like what I had been hinting at all along, a business struggling under pressure, finally giving in. Suppliers started pulling back, clients hesitated, and the cracks I'd been managing suddenly became visible to everyone. I remember sitting in my office the day it all started unraveling publicly. Emails piling up, calls I didn't answer, notifications I deliberately ignored. It felt surreal. Because none of it was accidental. I had engineered this version of failure, controlled just enough to protect what I'd already moved, chaotic enough to look real. People around me were reacting in real time, confused, frustrated, some even sympathetic. And I played my part. Stress voice. Apologies. Promises that things might still work out. The strangest thing? A part of me felt relief. Like the waiting was finally over. And the worst had already passed out. I thought the hardest part would be pulling it off. It wasn't. The hardest part was facing people once it all started falling apart. Employees began asking real questions. Not the casual, "Are we okay?" kind, but the ones that come from fear, about salaries, about jobs, about whether they should start looking elsewhere. I had meetings where I stood in front of people who depended on me and gave them answers that were technically true, but completely misleading. That's a special kind of dishonesty. Some suppliers weren't as patient anymore either. Calls got sharper. Emails lost their polite tone. A few of them hinted at legal action if things didn't improve quickly. I responded just enough to keep them from escalating too fast. But what stayed with me were the quieter reactions. One of my managers, someone who'd been with me almost from the beginning, came into my office and just asked, "Did we do something wrong?" "Not you. We." I told him no. And I'd never felt more aware of lying than in that moment. I managed to keep everything from completely exploding for a few more weeks. But pressure doesn't just disappear, it builds. And eventually it started coming from places I couldn't easily deflect. One morning, I received a formal notice from a creditor. Not just a warning, something more structured, more serious. The kind of document that signals people are done negotiating and ready to escalate. That's when it stopped feeling like a controlled situation. Up until then, I'd convinced myself I was ahead of everything, that I could predict how it would unfold. But legal processes don't care about your plans. They follow their own timeline. I started getting calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Some I ignored. Some I answered and immediately regretted. The tone had shifted completely. Less discussion, more demand. And then there were rumors. I heard from someone that people in the industry were talking. Not specifics, just enough to suggest that my restructuring story wasn't holding up as well as I thought. For the first time, I considered the possibility that I hadn't been as careful as I believed. Once things started moving legally, I switched into a different kind of survival mode. Not planning anymore, reacting. I hired a lawyer, framed everything as a business failure, nothing unusual. Companies go under all the time. Markets shift, cash flow breaks, debts pile up. On paper, my situation didn't look that unique. That was the angle. I stuck to it in every conversation. Overextended, unfortunate timing, trying my best to manage a difficult situation. I avoided specifics unless absolutely necessary and let professionals handle anything formal. But behind that, I was constantly calculating. What had I moved? What could still be traced? Who had seen what and when? I replayed every decision in my head, looking for weak points I might have missed. Sleep got inconsistent. Some nights I convinced myself I'd done enough to stay safe. Other nights, I was sure everything would unravel with one phone call or one document I hadn't accounted for. That's the thing about plans like this, they don't end when you execute them. They follow you. As weeks turned into months, the situation stabilized on the surface. Proceedings moved slowly, conversations became more procedural, less emotional. From the outside, it probably looked like I was just another business owner dealing with failure. But internally, something had changed. I became cautious in a way I hadn't been before. Every interaction felt like it had layers. Every question sounded like it might be leading somewhere. I started second-guessing things that used to feel simple: what to say, what not to say, how much to reveal. Even outside of work, it didn't switch off. Friends would ask how I was doing, and I'd give them a filtered version. Not a complete lie, but not the truth either. I realized I was doing it automatically, without thinking. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about the company anymore. It had started to affect how I operated as a person. I'd crossed a line, and it wasn't just legal, it was internal. And I didn't know how to step back from that version of myself. In the end, nothing dramatic happened. No arrest. No late-night knock on the door. No moment where everything collapsed at once. The company went through the formal process, debts were written off or settled in ways that looked legitimate enough, and life moved on. At least on paper. The new company, what I'd quietly built on the side, kept operating. Smaller, more controlled, but functional. To anyone looking from the outside, it probably seemed like I'd taken a hit, learned from it, and started again. A recovery story. But that's not how it felt. Because getting away with it isn't clean. It doesn't close anything. If anything, it leaves things open. Questions, what-ifs, moments that replay when you don't expect them. I'd see former employees occasionally. Some found new jobs, some struggled. Conversations were polite, but there was always something unspoken underneath. And every time, I wondered how much they suspected. Or worse, how much they trusted me back then. That part doesn't go away. If you're expecting some clean moral ending, don't do this, crime doesn't pay, I get it. That's usually how stories like this wrap up. But the truth is more uncomfortable. On paper, I came out ahead. I avoided the worst financial consequences. I kept something alive from what should have completely collapsed. If you measure it purely in numbers, you could argue it worked. But that's a narrow way to look at it. What I didn't account for was the cost you carry afterward. Not fear of getting caught, though that lingers, but the quieter stuff. The way you start justifying things faster. The way honesty becomes flexible if the pressure is high enough. That's the real shift. I used to think there were lines I wouldn't cross. Now I know those lines move if you let them. And once they move, it's hard to trust your own judgment the next time things get difficult. So if anyone reading this thinks about doing something similar, don't focus on whether you can get away with it. Ask yourself who you'll be if you do,